You're a hell of a mover. Man, you really put them on their asses last night. That's what Fred Astaire, the most respected dancer in American history, said to a 24-year-old kid from Gary, Indiana, the morning after 47 million people watched him do something nobody had ever seen before on live television. But here's what most people don't know. The man who just received the greatest compliment of his life had spent the night before crying backstage because he thought he'd failed. And the dance move that changed everything? He'd only finished putting it together the night before taping. He never showed it to the producers. He never showed it to his brothers. He never rehearsed it on that stage, not once. What happened on May 16, 1983 wasn't supposed to happen the way it did, and the story behind it is stranger, riskier, and more human than the legend ever lets on. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Michael Jackson almost didn't show up that night, why the most famous dance move in history was performed by a man who didn't even want to be on that stage, and why 5 seconds of footage from a Motown anniversary special turned a pop star into something the music industry had never seen before and hasn't seen since. But first, let's kill 3 things people still get wrong about that night. Myth 1. Michael Jackson invented the moonwalk. He didn't. The move had been around for decades. It was called the backslide. Cab Calloway was doing variations of it as far back as the 1930s. He called it the buzz. Tap dancer Bill Bailey performed a clear version on film in 1955 at the Apollo Theater, sliding backward into the wings at the end of his tap routine for almost 15 seconds straight. French mime Marcel Marceau used a version of it throughout his career in his famous walking against the wind routine. Even David Bowie incorporated elements of the move into his mime pieces in the 1960s, having studied under mime master Etienne Decroix. But the direct line to Michael ran through a dancer named Jeffrey Daniel, a member of the soul trio Shalimar, who was doing the backslide on British television in the early 80s. LaToya Jackson confirmed in an interview that her brother learned the move from Daniel. Michael took it home, practiced it obsessively, added his own arm movements and shoulder isolations, timed it against the bass line of Billie Jean, and turned a street dance technique into something that looked like a glitch in reality. He didn't invent it. He made the world forget that anyone else had ever done it, and then he renamed it. Myth 2. That night was just a performance. It wasn't. It was a negotiation, a family reunion, a power play, and a solo declaration of independence, all compressed into a 5-minute window on a show that was supposed to be about Motown's past, not Michael's future. Myth 3. Michael was confident that night. He wasn't even close. He cried backstage after the performance. He told Oprah Winfrey 10 years later that he thought he'd blown it because he couldn't hold his toe, stand as long as he'd wanted. 47 million people watched a moment that redefined pop culture. The man who created it walked off stage thinking he'd let everyone down. Now here's how it actually happened. To understand what happened on May 16, 1983, you've got to understand what was happening in the months before it. Michael Jackson had released Thriller on November 30, 1982. It was his 6th studio album, produced with Quincy Jones, and by the early weeks of 1983, it was already climbing towards something nobody in the music industry had ever seen. Billie Jean dropped as a single on January 2, 1983. Within weeks, it was climbing the charts at a speed that made the rest of the industry nervous. By March 5, it was sitting at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It would stay there for 7 consecutive weeks, the longest number 1 run of Michael's career up to that point, and a record he wouldn't match until Black or White in 1991. But the chart dominance wasn't just about one song. It was about all of them, all at once. And here's the part that still blows people's minds. When Billie Jean finally came down from number 1, the song that replaced it was also Michael Jackson. Beat It took over. There was barely a week's gap between his own songs trading the top spot. That almost never happens. 2 consecutive number 1 singles from the same album, back-to-back from the same artist. In 1983, that was like watching someone win the Super Bowl, and then immediately win it again the next week. During a 6-week stretch that spring, Michael became the first artist in history to simultaneously top 4 Billboard charts: the Hot 100, the Billboard 200, the Black Singles Chart, and the Black LPs Chart. No male artist has matched that 6-week run since. But there was a problem, a big one. MTV, the most powerful music platform in America, had barely touched him. The channel launched in August 1981. By early 1983, its playlist was almost entirely white rock artists. Black musicians were essentially locked out. When CBS Records pushed MTV to air the Billie Jean video, the network's initial response, according to the video's director Steve Barron, was that it wasn't right for their audience. Walter Yetnikoff, the president of CBS Records, reportedly lost it. He told MTV executives he'd pull every CBS artist off the network if they didn't play the video. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, MTV insiders later disputed the confrontation. The result was the same. On March 10, 1983, the Billie Jean video went into heavy rotation on MTV. Michael Jackson became the first black artist to receive that treatment on the network. The official Michael Jackson website confirmed it. Billie Jean on MTV opened the floodgates, and it didn't just change MTV. It changed the entire concept of what a music video was supposed to be. Before Billie Jean, videos were promotional tools, cheap clips shot in a warehouse with a fog machine. Director Steve Barron shot the Billie Jean video on 35mm film. The glowing sidewalk tiles, the disappearing act, the cinematic quality. It looked like a short film, not a commercial. Michael insisted on controlling the camera work and the stage lighting himself. He wanted to make sure every frame served the performance. As Time magazine's music critic Jay Cox wrote in 1984, Thriller brought black music back to mainstream radio, from which it had been effectively banished after restrictive special format programming was introduced in the mid-70s. The year before Thriller, only 2 songs by black artists, Lionel Richie and Stevie Wonder, had reached #1 on the Hot 100. Michael didn't just break through, he kicked the door down. So by late March 1983, Michael was the biggest artist on the planet. #1 on every chart. The first black face in heavy rotation on MTV. Thriller was selling faster than anything in the history of recorded music. The album had already hit #1 on the Billboard 200 on February 6, 1983, and it would stay in that top spot for a record-setting 37 non-consecutive weeks. But the momentum needed fuel. The charts don't care about last month. They care about next week's week. And then Berry Gordy called. Gordy wanted Michael to perform at Motown 25. Yesterday, Today, Forever, a television special celebrating the 25th anniversary of Motown Records. The label had been founded in Detroit in 1959. By the late 60s, it was putting out hits at a rate nobody in the industry could match. Nearly 80 records in the Billboard Top 10 in that decade alone. The Temptations, The Supremes, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, Gladys Knight, the Four Tops, and the Jackson 5, who'd signed their first Motown recording contract in 1968. When Michael was 10 years old, the Jackson 5 released 10 studio albums with Motown before leaving for Epic Records in 1975. Michael was 17 when they walked away. Now, 8 years later, Gordy wanted the family back one more time. For the cameras, Michael said no, he didn't want to do it. In his 1988 autobiography, Moonwalk, he wrote it plainly. I said no to the idea at first. My whole attitude towards TV is fairly negative. He thought appearing on the show would overexpose him at the worst possible time. He was in the middle of the biggest album rollout in history. Looking backward didn't fit the plan. But Berry Gordy didn't take no for an answer. He came to see Michael in person, showed up at a studio session, sat with him, and asked him directly. There was history between them. Gordy had signed the Jackson 5 when nobody else would touch a group of kids from Gary, Indiana. He'd given them their first shot. He'd built the machine that made Michael a child star. That kind of debt doesn't disappear just because the contract expires. Michael finally agreed, but he had one condition. He'd reunite with his brothers for a Jackson 5 medley. He'd do the nostalgia bit. But after that, he wanted his own solo spot, and he wanted to perform Billie Jean. That was a bold demand. Billie Jean had nothing to do with Motown. It was an Epic Records release. Every other song on the show was a Motown track. Producer Suzanne DePass and director Don Mischer had already told every performer on the lineup, including Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, and Diana Ross, that no one was allowed to perform new music. Motown songs only. Gordy made an exception for Michael. He knew what he had. But here's the detail that reframes the entire night. Michael didn't rehearse the moonwalk on that stage. Not during the run-throughs. Not during the technical checks. According to Michael himself, in Moonwalk, he'd been practicing the move in his kitchen. He perfected the choreography and the full performance of Billie Jean just the night before the taping. Nobody on the production team knew what was coming. His brothers didn't know. The camera operators didn't know. Even Berry Gordy didn't know. The most famous moment in live television performance history was a complete surprise to every single person in that building, except the man doing it. March 25, 1983, the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, Pasadena, California. The taping of Motown 25. The show was stacked. Richard Pryor, the biggest comedian in the country, hosted. Smokey Robinson reunited with the Miracles. The Temptations and the Four Tops faced off in a battle of the bands. Diana Ross came back with the Supremes for one last take on Someday We'll Be Together. Marvin Gaye sat down at a piano and gave a speech about the history of black music in America before singing What's Going On to a standing ovation. It would be one of his last major television appearances before his murder by his own father the following April. This wasn't a casual TV taping. This was a room full of people who'd built an entire genre of American music from a small house in Detroit, Hitsville, USA, the nickname for the original Motown studio at 2648 West Grand Boulevard, where Berry Gordy had turned a family home into a hit factory that put nearly 80 records in the Billboard Top 10 between 1960 and 1969. Every person on that stage that night had a story. Marvin Gaye's performance of What's Going On would turn out to be one of his final national television appearances. Less than 13 months later, on April 1, 1984, his own father would shoot and kill him. The Four Tops and the Temptations trading sons back and forth in their Battle of the Bands segment felt like watching two heavyweight champions spar for old time's sake. Diana Ross pulled Mary Wilson and Cindy Birdsong back on stage for a Supremes reunion that hadn't happened in years, and when Ross pushed Wilson during the performance, the moment became its own piece of television history. The whole night was charged. Everybody in that auditorium knew they were watching something that couldn't be repeated. And then the Jackson 5 came on. It was the first time the five brothers had performed together since 1975, the year the group left Motown for Epic Records. It was the first time Jermaine Jackson, who'd stayed behind at Motown when the rest of the family left, had stood on stage with his brothers in 8 years. Randy Jackson joined them too. They performed a medley: I Want You Back, The Love You Save, Never Can Say Goodbye, I'll Be There. The crowd went crazy. The nostalgia was thick. You could feel it in the room. Then the medley ended. And this is where three forces collided. Force 1, the image. The audience expected Michael to be the kid from the Jackson 5, the Motown baby, the boy they'd watched grow up on television. The entire show was built around looking backward. Force 2, the machine. Thriller was in the middle of a historic chart run. Billie Jean was still the #1 song in America. The industry was watching. MTV was watching. CBS was watching. The album's sales trajectory, already enormous, was about to be decided by what happened next. Force 3, the man. Michael Jackson was 24 years old. He'd been performing since he was 5. He'd spent his entire childhood in rehearsal rooms, on tour buses, and on stages. Not because he chose to, but because his father made him. Joe Jackson ran the Jackson 5 like a military operation. The rehearsals were punishing. The discipline was absolute. By the time Michael was 10, he'd already seen more of the inside of recording studios than most musicians see in a lifetime. And now, for the first time in his career, he was about to stand alone on a stage and do something entirely on his own terms. No brothers flanking him. No choreographer standing in the wings telling him where to move. No rehearse blocking that the camera crew could follow. No safety net of any kind. Just him, a bass line, and a move he'd been practicing in his kitchen. All three forces, the image, the machine, the man, were converging on the same stage, the same spotlight, the same 5 minutes of television. And nobody in that building except Michael knew what was about to happen next. Michael walked to the front of the stage. He spoke to the crowd, something he rarely did during performances. He thanked his brothers. He thanked Berry Gordy. And then he said something that most people don't remember. He said he loved the old songs, but he also had something new he wanted to do. Then he reached down, picked up a black fedora from the floor, and slammed it onto his head. The opening bass line of Billie Jean hit the speakers, and the building shifted. Fast forward 4 decades. You've seen the Moonwalk 1,000 times. You've seen it parodied, imitated, slowed down frame by frame on YouTube. Every wedding DJ in America has watched some drunk uncle try it at a reception. The move has been replayed so many times that it's almost lost its weight. So let me put you back in that room. In 1983, before the internet, before social media, before anyone could watch anything on demand, there was no instant replay for a television audience. There was no rewinding live TV. If you missed it, you missed it. If you saw it once, at full speed, in real time, and then it was over. That's the context. One shot, one take, no do-overs, and nobody in the Pasadena Civic Auditorium had any idea what was about to happen. Because in that room, nobody had seen it before. Not the audience, not the producers, not the cameramen. Nobody knew it was coming. The performance was lip-synced. Michael used the album version of Billie Jean because the live band couldn't replicate the exact sound he wanted. But nobody cared. Because Michael wasn't just singing. He was moving in a way that didn't make sense. He spun. He froze. He kicked. His body moved like it was made of something other than muscle and bone. The sequined jacket caught every light in the building. The single glove on his left hand flashed every time his arm cut through the air. And then, during the instrumental bridge, it happened. He planted his feet. He leaned forward, and he slid backward, smooth, effortless, like the floor had turned to ice underneath him, but only underneath him. Everyone else in the building was still standing on solid ground. His legs moved forward. His body moved backward. It didn't make sense. The human brain saw a contradiction it couldn't resolve, and the only response was to scream. The audience screamed. He did it again. 3, 4 glides backward, each one smoother than the last. The sequin jacket caught the light with every shift. The white socks, visible below his cropped tuxedo pants, made his feet look like they were floating. And then he stopped, on his toes, and held a toe stand that looked like it broke every law of physics a human body is supposed to follow. Feet together, body straight. Balanced on the tips of his penny loafers like a ballerina on point, except he wasn't a ballerina. He was a 24-year-old pop singer in a sequin jacket who'd just done something that made an entire auditorium forget how to breathe. The Pasadena Civic Auditorium erupted. People were on their feet. People were grabbing each other. People were screaming in a way that had nothing to do with being fans, and everything to do with watching something impossible happen in front of them. 5 seconds of footage, maybe less, but here's what the cameras didn't capture. Michael walked off stage and he cried. He cried because he thought he'd messed up. The toe stand, that frozen gravity-defying moment at the end, hadn't lasted as long as he'd planned. In his head, he'd failed. He told Oprah Winfrey about it in 1993. I was backstage and I was crying. I thought I did terrible. Think about that. 47 million people were about to watch a moment that would be called one of the most important performances in television history. Entertainment Weekly would later name it one of the most significant pop culture moments ever recorded. The New York Times would call the routine astonishing. The performance would earn an Emmy nomination for Best Individual Performance on a Variety or music program, and the man who did it was backstage in tears. But then, as Michael was walking to his car, a child stopped him, a kid in the hallway. And the kid looked at him and said, "You're amazing. Who taught you to ever dance like that?" Michael said later, and for the first time, I thought I did a good job, because children don't lie. Now go back to the phone call. The show aired on NBC on May 16, 1983. 47 million viewers tuned in, roughly 35% of every television set in America. By this point, Billie Jean had finally dropped from #1, but Beat It had taken its place. Michael Jackson owned the top of the charts coming and going. The next morning, America woke up different. People talked about it in offices. They talked about it in school cafeterias. They talked about it on the subway, in taxicabs, in grocery store checkout lines. There was no Twitter. There was no TikTok. There was no way to share a clip. The only way to talk about what Michael Jackson had just done was to describe it to someone who hadn't seen it. And half the time, the person describing it couldn't find the words. What do you call a man who appears to walk forward while sliding backward? Nobody had a name for it yet. And then Fred Astaire, 83 years old, the man who danced with Ginger Rogers, who'd set the standard for every dancer in the 20th century, picked up his phone and called Michael Jackson. "You're a hell of a mover. Man, you really put them on their asses last night." Michael wrote about that call in his autobiography. He said, Astaire told him he'd taped the performance and watched it again the next morning. Then Astaire said something that stuck. "You're an angry dancer. I'm the same way. I used to do the same thing with my cane." Michael called it the greatest compliment I had ever received in my life and the only one I had ever wanted to believe. He later met with Astaire in person. He also met with Gene Kelly and choreographer Hermes Pan separately, and they traded dance moves. Michael taught all three of them the moonwalk. He wrote about those meetings with a kind of reverence he rarely showed anywhere else. It was a fantastic experience. I felt that I had been inducted into an informal fraternity of dancers, and I felt so honored because these were the people I most admired in the world. And then, according to author Steve Knopper's biography of Jackson, after hanging up the phone with Astaire that first morning, Michael went into the bathroom and threw up. That's who he was. A man who could make 47 million people stop breathing for 5 seconds and then go be sick because the weight of what just happened was too much to carry. The aftershock didn't stop. Producer Don Mischer traveled to Washington a few weeks later to film an interview with Nancy Reagan. He told HuffPost what happened. Coming down the elevator of the hotel, everybody's talking about Michael. In the taxicab going to the White House, everybody was talking about Michael. In the East Wing of the White House, everybody's talking about Motown 25 and Michael. Not the president, not politics, not world events, Michael Jackson. In the White House. Here's what people miss when they talk about Motown 25. They talk about the moonwalk like it was a magic trick. Like Michael pulled a rabbit out of a hat and the crowd went wild. But that's not what happened. What happened was something more rare than a dance move. A 24-year-old man stood on a stage built to celebrate the past and used it to announce the future. He took a show designed to look backward and turned it into the single most forward-looking moment in pop music history. He did it while terrified. He did it without a safety net. He did it without telling anyone what he was about to do. He did it on a night when every Motown legend alive was standing backstage, watching. Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Berry Gordy himself. And instead of trying to fit in with their legacy, he stepped past it. Think about the nerve that takes. 24 years old, a room full of the people who made him. And he walks out there and does something none of them have ever seen before. Something he's never even shown them, and trusts his body to hold up under the weight of the moment. The tragedy of Motown 25 isn't what happened on stage. The tragedy is that the world saw a man who looked like he had complete control, and the man himself felt like he was falling apart. That gap between what the audience sees and what the performer feels. That's the story of Michael Jackson's entire life. And it started right there, on that stage in Pasadena, on a night when everyone in America was watching, and only one person in the building thought it wasn't good enough. After that night, Thriller's sales went through the roof. The album was already selling fast. But after Motown 25 aired, it hit 1 million copies a week worldwide. By the end of 1983, it had moved over 32 million units, officially becoming the best-selling album of all time. It would eventually reach an estimated 70 million copies sold worldwide, a record that still stands. All 7 of Thriller's singles reached the top 10 on the Billboard Hot 100, another record at the time. The Motown 25 special itself earned 9 Emmy nominations. It won for Best Variety Music or Comedy Program. Don Mischer won the Directors Guild Award. And the moonwalk became the most imitated dance move on the planet. Kids across America started wearing one glove to school. Michael's signature look, the fedora, the sequin jacket, the high-water pants, the white socks, became the most recognizable outfit in pop culture. The single rhinestone glove he wore that night, previously worn on his right hand during earlier performances, moved permanently to his left hand after Motown 25. The switch freed his right hand for choreography, pointing, throwing his hat, holding the microphone. One small wardrobe decision made for practical reasons became one of the most iconic visual trademarks in entertainment history. Entertainment Weekly later named the Motown 25 performance one of the most important pop culture moments ever recorded. Editor Steve Daly put it this way: "It was a moment that crossed over in a way that no live musical performance ever had. There was a messianic quality to it." Every concert performance of Billie Jean that followed, for the rest of Michael's life, mirrored what he did on that stage in Pasadena: the fedora, the jacket, the glove, the moonwalk during the bridge. He kept the template locked for over 25 years because it didn't need changing. Every audience reacted the same way the Pasadena audience did, every single time. MTV got the ratings, CBS got the revenue, Motown got its anniversary moment. The industry got the blueprint for how to sell music through spectacle, and Michael, he got a phone call from Fred Astaire and a night he couldn't stop replaying in his head, wondering if it was good enough. There's something worth sitting with here. 47 million people saw a man who looked untouchable, who looked like he was born to do exactly what he was doing, who moved across that stage like the laws of the physical world didn't apply to him. But behind the curtain, that same man was crying because his toe stand didn't last long enough. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about greatness. The audience sees the magic. They don't see the person who can't stop asking whether the magic was real. They don't see the drive that makes someone practice a dance move in their kitchen the night before performing it in front of the world, and then collapse under the pressure of wondering if they did it right. Michael Jackson didn't just change pop music on May 16, 1983. He showed, without meaning to, what it costs to be the person the world can't look away from. He was 24 years old. He'd been on stage since he was 5. That's 19 years of performing before he did the thing the world would remember him for. 19 years of rehearsal rooms, of his father's discipline, of tour buses and stages and cameras and strangers screaming his name. And on the night that all of it paid off, on the night that everything he'd ever worked for landed in a single 5-second moment that 47 million people would never forget, he walked off stage and cried because he thought it wasn't good enough. The applause comes easy. Living inside the silence afterward. That's the part nobody teaches you. Sometimes the world doesn't destroy a performer by ignoring him. Sometimes it destroys him by needing him to be perfect every single time he steps into the light. But Motown 25 wasn't the last time Michael tried to rewrite the rules on live television. There was another night, another stage, another audience that thought they knew what they were about to see. They were wrong. That story is next.